Dear SBI, it's a great honor for me to present Norwegian climate policies and our progress towards our targets. I would also like to thank the many parties that have asked us questions. This presentation is made on a backdrop of a yet more domestic temperature records. Climate change is happening, especially rapidly in the Arctic. Norway's proximity to the Arctic means that the temperature in Norway is also increasing faster than the global average. The weather is becoming more extreme, and we see the results of climate change. The second picture on this slide is taken after an extreme weather event called Hans that hit southern Norway in 2023, causing floods and landslides. Norway is blessed with rich natural resources. Almost all electricity production comes from renewable energy sources, mainly flexible hydropower. Thus, Norway's challenge is to cut emissions in other sectors. The total greenhouse gas emission in Norway in 2023 were about 46.6 million tons of CO2 equivalents, excluding LULUCF. This figure shows Norwegian emissions in 2023 divided by sectors. The oil and gas sectors, industry and transport are the main sources of emissions. Norway is a constitutional monarchy with a democratic parliamentary system of governance. The Storting, which is the name of the Norwegian parliament, determines Norway's overall climate policy, and the government implements and administers the policies and measures. Although not a member of the European Union, Norway has been part of the Union's internal market through the EEA agreement since 1994. This allows Norway and the other EEA/EFTA states to participate in the single market with the EU countries and oblige the EEA/EFTA states to implement relevant EU legislation, including on the environment. Furthermore, Norway takes part in a climate agreement with the EU and Iceland. This means that Norway takes part in and have implemented EU's climate legislation for the period 2021 to 2030. Our participation in the EU legislation gives important contributions to the fulfillment of Norwegian climate targets. Norway met its target of 30% cut in 2020 through the meeting its commitment and the second commitment period in the Kyoto Protocol. The single-year target was translated to a budget, but the commitment was to reduce our average annual emissions in the period 2013 to 2020 by 16%, compared to Norway's emissions in 1990. Despite strong economic and population growth over decades, domestic climate measures curbed national emissions, which peaked in 2007. Most of the remaining gap between our actual emissions and the commitment period under the Kyoto was closed with Kyoto units reflecting Norwegian companies' net purchase of allowances in the EU emission trading system, and the rest was covered with units from the Clean Development Mechanism acquired through the government's purchase program. Norway submitted its settlement and final report for the second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol in October 2023. This slide illustrates our gradually more ambitious climate targets. Our commitment for 2013 to 2020 under the Kyoto Protocol was derived from our original target of 30% cut in 2020. Our current NDC for 2030 under the Paris Agreement has been enhanced twice and is economy-wide, covering all sectors. Norway will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% from the emission levels in the reference year 1990. Our target in 2050 is to become a low-emission society and reduce emissions by 90 to 95% compared to 1990. Targets for 2030 and 2050 are reflected in the Norwegian Climate Change Act. The effect of Norway's participation in the EU ETS is to be taken into account in assessing progress towards these targets. This means that the targets for 2030 and 2050 are not purely domestic targets. The Norwegian government is currently developing our next NDC for the period after 2030 under the Paris Agreement. In October, the government initiated a public hearing, issuing a proposal for the new NDC for 2035 to be included in the Norwegian Climate Change Act. The final goal will be presented by the government to the Parliament after the public hearing. Cost-effectiveness and cross-sectoral policies and measures are key criteria when deciding climate policy. In addition, the polluter pays principle is an important element. The principle implies that the polluter should bear the cost of environmental harm. We have a comprehensive set of measures covering almost all emissions of greenhouse gases as well as removals. Important instruments of Norwegian climate policy are taxes on greenhouse gas emissions and emission trading. Both instruments put a price on emissions and make it more expensive to release greenhouse gases. Taxes provide an incentive to reduce emissions both through immediate action and through investment in research and development that will make it possible to reduce emission at a later date. CO2 taxes and quotas in EU ETS cover approximately 85% of greenhouse gas emissions in Norway. In addition to instruments that put a price on emissions, the government uses other policy instruments to reduce barriers and correct market failures related to technology development and in specific markets. Effective transition requires a combination of measures. Among them is support for research and technology development and requirements and bans. An example of this is the ban of use of fossil oil for heating of buildings. The ban covers the use of mineral oil for heating in residential buildings, public buildings, commercial buildings, and for heating and drying on construction sites. The ban followed almost 3 decades of taxing the CO2 content of heating oil, which already led to very low usage for heating and paved the way for a full phase-out. A phase-out of organic waste to landfills was possibly already in 2009, a ban which was also preceded by use of economic instruments. Norway's decentralized settlement gives rise to a relatively high demand for transport. In addition, the Norwegian economy is largely based on the extraction of raw materials and exports of goods, which means that there is a large volume of goods transport. About 1/3 of the Norwegian greenhouse gas emissions originated from transport in 2023. There are several measures in place that affect greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. The tax policy is central, and the CO2 tax, which is a cross-sectoral measure, is of great importance of the transport sector. The Parliament has set a goal that all new passenger cars in Norway are to be zero-emission vehicles, ZEVs, in 2025. To achieve this goal, we use very strong incentives, mainly tax incentives for electric vehicles, but also measures like free parking, exemption from payments in tolling stations and on ferries, and access to bus lanes have been important measures. We have also used our state agency Enova to help the transition by offering support schemes for purchasing commercial ZEVs and home chargers. There have been several support schemes both for individuals and businesses. Both the measures have contributed to a substantial increase in the sales of electric vehicles in recent years. ZEVs make up about 95% of new passenger car sales in the last couple of months. In terms of the total fleet, ZEVs now amount to about 1/4 of the total passenger car fleet. As new cars replace old ones, the entire fleet eventually will be ZEV. Norway has demonstrated experience with safe and secure carbon capture and storage. Since 1996, CO2 from natural gas production at the Sleipner field in the Norwegian continental shelf has been captured and re-injected into seabed formation. The Snøhvit project started already in 2008. A full-scale CCS demonstration project, Longship, for capture, transport and storage of CO2 is under development in Norway. The Longship project is a central part of the Norwegian government's policy for CO2 management and of Norway's contribution to developing necessary climate technologies. The project consists of 2 Norwegian CO2 capture facilities, Hafslund Celsius Waste Incineration Plant in Oslo and Heidelberg Materials Cement Plant in Brevik, and a CO2 transport and storage project which is called Northern Lights. The permanent storage will take place 2,600 meters under the seabed on the Norwegian continental shelf. The Longship project is a result of close cooperation between the government and industrial partners over many years. Gassnova, the state enterprise for CCS in Norway, is responsible for coordination of the CCS chain. The government has provided most of the funding for the 2 above-mentioned capture projects, as well as the storage facility of the Longship project. The project is expected to be operational in the first half of 2025. In its first phase, the potential is 1.5 million tons of CO2 stored annually. In its second phase, the potential is of 5 million tons stored annually. The government has also supported the world's largest and most flexible test center for CO2 capture technology, the Technology Center Mongstad. It has been in operation since 2012 and has been crucial in developing the capture technology used in Longship. The Norwegian government's CCS strategy spanned activities from research, development and demonstration to large-scale projects, commercial CO2 storage on the Norwegian continental shelf, and international work promoting CCS. The Norwegian government will continue its work on promoting CO2 management as a global climate mitigation tool in decarbonized, hard-to-abate industries. In 2023, the Norwegian government presented a white paper to the Parliament on climate change adaptation. This outlines Norway's efforts and measures to prepare and adapt nature and society to climate change, aiming to create a climate-resilient society. An important objective is to establish a better governance system for national adaptation efforts. The Norwegian Environment Agency is in the process of developing Norway's first climate change vulnerability analysis in cooperation with relevant sector authorities and other actors. The analysis is expected to be completed by the end of 2026. Finally, I would like to mention that developing a more systematic approach to the development of climate policy has been a task of the last years for the government. Relevant points in this context would be to build a stronger cooperation between the different ministries working with climate, to make sure that measures become a more integrated part of the budget process, improving transparency and methods for the calculation of effect of measures, and annual reports in accordance with the climate law. Thank you all for your attention.